So this lecture is going to focus on things that may not have been covered adequately in the crash course videos. So with epithelial tissues, remember you have this basement membrane that the epithelial tissues are attached to because they're on surfaces, but the free surface may be specialized to reflect the function of the particular organ that they lie within. For example, microvilli will be a bunch of small finger-like projections on the surface of each individual cell that increase the surface area for absorption, and you'll tend to find these in the epithelial cells of the small intestine. Or they may have cilia on the surface, which are little finger-like projections, slightly different than microvilli, that tend to wave in one direction and will move mucus in a single direction. So in the airways, for example, the mucus can be spit out or swallowed. And so that leads us into talking about specialized epithelial cells that are glands. And the type of gland can be either unicellular, meaning one cell, or multicellular. And the best example, and probably the only example I can think of at the moment that is unicellular, are goblet cells that you'll often see associated with ciliated epithelial cells. And these goblet cells will secrete mucus to the surface of the epithelial cells so that it will trap debris, and those cilia cells will then move the mucus plus the debris to an area where they can be gotten rid of easily. But the majority of your glands will be multicellular, and they're divided into specific types. There are your alveolar or acinar type glands, and you notice that the glands, again, multicellular, but they have this shape like the alveoli in the lungs, and we'll discuss that more when we get to respiratory, but you should probably remember that from undergrad A&P classes, that alveoli have this grape-like cluster appearance, and that's how these glands will appear as well. That's why they're called alveolar or acinar. Other types of glands are simple tubular, so it is in the shape of a tube or various types of tubes where things are secreted and they move through the tube to the surface. And there you see, you'll see tubular glands in the intestines, sweat glands, and various other digestive glands as well. And finally, you'll have your compound glands, which can either be compound alveolar. Notice that there are multiple grape-like clusters here. Typically you'll find those in mammary glands. Or a mixture of tubular plus alveolar, which you'll find in salivary glands and some in respiratory passage. Or compound tubular, in other words, multiple types of tubular glands, which can be found in the bulbourethral glands in the male reproductive system, in the testes, and even some mucus glands. So not all mucus glands are strictly goblet cells, unicellular, but some of them are compound tubular glands that you can find in the mouth, where you need to produce large amounts of mucus. Now, other than shape of the gland, glands can also be classified according to what they secrete, not the specific things they secrete like milk or oil, but what is it that makes up that milk or oil. So the first type is merocrine secretion, where the glands will secrete strictly a fluid substance. And remember from a previous lecture that fluid is water plus the stuff that's dissolved in it. So literally, exocytosis, it will be the secretions from the gland. The second is apocrine secretion, where a part of the cell will literally pinch off, and that will go out with the fluids that are in the secretion. And then finally, holocrine secretion, where, as shown here, an entire cell will mature, die off, and become the actual secretory product. Now, all of these, you have to figure that even though they're solutes, parts of cells, and whole cells, they will be part of an aqueous solution that reaches the surface of the gland. Now, some other broad categories of secretion are endocrine secretion, which is endo meaning inside. So that's basically hormones secreting their products into the bloodstream to have an effect inside the body. So the example given here, pituitary glands, or any glands in your body, hormone secreting glands. Or exocrine secretion, exo meaning outside. So these are cells that will, or glandular epithelium that will secrete substances that go into tubes or acini and get secreted to the surface of things where they leave the body. So here you'd see a sweat gland and the secretion is leaving the body through the surface of the skin. Or if you're talking about pancreatic secretions or digestive secretions, they exit the body through the intestines with your excrement. Other types of secretion include paracrine secretion, where a product will be released by one cell and will act locally on another cell. And examples of these would be prostaglandins being released by cells that will go to neighboring blood vessels and cause them to vasodilate and the capillaries to become more permeable, for example. And autocrine secretion, where a cell will secrete a substance and then that substance will go back, bind to a receptor on that same cell. It could also bind to receptors on other cells as well, and activate that cell. And you'll see this a lot in immune responses, where a single cell will tend to auto-regulate itself through autocrine secretion. Now, moving to the connective tissues, types of cells that are in connective tissues. I know fibroblasts were mentioned, but specifically you should be aware that they are the ones that are secreting those fibers, and there are different types of fibroblasts, which we're not going to get into, including collagen, elastin, and generally they have a big star-like shape and are easily identified under a microscope and tend to be the most common fixed cell within connective tissue. Mast cells, although they are a type of connective tissue cell, do not originate in connective tissues. They originate in the bone marrow along with other white blood cells. But once they take up residence in connective tissues, their job is to take part in inflammatory responses by releasing heparin, which prevents blood clotting, so blood can move more freely through an area where inflammation is taking place, and release histamine. And histamine will aid in the inflammatory response by dilating blood vessels, for example. And histamine is also involved in promoting allergies, asthma, hay fever, which are not necessarily physiological responses, but more pathophysiological responses that cause problems in our body. And finally, macrophages, another type of white blood cell that does not originate in connective tissues, but many of its functions are located within connective tissues. So what macrophages do is, when they get the signal from inflammatory responses, for example, they will migrate from the blood vessels into the connective tissue, and by diapedesis and chemoattraction find their way to the area of infection, area of inflammation, and then scavenge up all of the either bacteria, if it happens to be bacteria, or all of the dead cells that are in that particular area, and basically clean up the mess for the rest of the body. And often when people say that something is resorbed in the body, usually it's macrophages coming up and cleaning up whatever's left over that got broken down by other processes. Now, as an introduction to various things we're going to talk about once we get to specific anatomy, are tissue membranes. And tissue membranes are various types of membranes composed of epithelial tissue that provide some sort of function on the surface in which they are contained. So some general types include mucous membranes, and of course mucous membranes we know line digestive, respiratory, urinary, reproductive tracts, and they have goblet cells within them that are secreting large amounts of mucus so that the surface of those membranes is very smooth and slippery, so things can move across them very easily. Serous membranes line the pleura of the lungs, the peritoneal cavities, and the pericardial sac. And basically, serous membranes produce serous fluid so that when the lungs are expanding and contracting, when the heart is contracting and relaxing, when there is movement in the digestive system, these two membranes with the serous fluid between them slide past one another and provide a frictionless movement to prevent injury while these organs are moving. The cutaneous membrane, which is the skin, covers our body, offers protection. That's pretty self-explanatory and will be talked more about in the skin section or integumentary section. And finally, synovial membranes, which are membranes that line the inner portion of joints, and they are the cells specifically that produce synovial fluid that lubricate the joints to aid in friction-free movement. And so this slide is just showing you the various body cavities, cranial cavity, vertebral cavity, pelvic, abdominal, thoracic cavity. And these cavities, especially the abdominal and the thoracic cavity, are lined by these serous membranes. And if you look at it, the serous membranes are basically a single sac into which the organ is inserted, and there's that fluid in between that sac, similar to what this picture shows if you were to put your fist into a fluid-filled balloon. And again, as the heart is moving or as the lungs are moving, it prevents friction so there's not damage to the organ or the wall that is surrounding the organ in the process of moving. And finally, fascia, which is a type of connective tissue that is going to come up again and again and again when we get to various regions of the body and anatomy. And so fascia, we can think about it as superficial fascia, that which is most superficial, most towards the surface. Remember, superficial versus deep. Typically, you'll find it between skin and the underlying organs. So here is between skin and underlying organs. And if you notice just by looking at it, it contains mostly adipose tissue that is surrounded by areolar tissue or loose connective tissue. And often we more commonly refer to this as the subcutaneous or hypodermic layer. The deep fascia is underneath the superficial fascia, obviously. And there can be many layers to deep fascia. Typically, you'll find it bound to capsules, such as your joint capsules, tendons, and ligaments, made up of dense connective tissue, the same thing that tendons and ligaments are made out of. And its job is to form a strong fibrous internal network that pretty much holds muscle and organs in place. So the deep fascia is really the integrity of your soft tissue in your body. And the last one is your subserous fascia, which if you're looking at this from superficial to deep, it is the deepest type of fascia that exists in your body. And you'll find it just superficial to the serous membrane. All right, and it's composed of areolar or that loose connective tissue that kind of binds things together.